Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you're listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Trade Wars Against America. This is by William Gill, and it was published in 1990. So this is sort of a part of that pushback from the late 80s and the 1990s against international free trade. There was a sort of a blossoming with the Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan campaigns. There was a sort of a paleo-conservative rise in that period of time, and part of that was pushing back against our international trade policies, and that's what this book is about. It's pushback against the free trade policies that had taken over U.S. International trade. And it basically talks about trade wars against America. It talks about how the rest of the world is essentially engaged in a trade war against us, and we're the only ones who are not aware that we're in a war. So the wars are against us, but we don't seem to be fighting back. This is the sort of book that walks through the history. A lot of books that deal with this topic are like this. They walk through the history of our trade policy. Some of them have more theory and less history, and some of them are almost entirely history, like this one. It's very interesting. It's a good book and interesting stuff. There's a particular area that I want to focus on today, which is some of the earlier stuff in the book. When they talk about the 19th century, the later half of the 19th century, and I'm going to read a little bit up through some of the Wilson administration, a little bit of the Wilson administration as well. But starting out with just like the end of the Civil War. So I've got 8 sections to read. Hopefully this doesn't get too overbearing. Like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections here out loud, provide a little bit of commentary. Not a tremendous amount of commentary. There's not much interpretation that needs to happen here. A lot of this is self-explanatory. It's kind of simply put, tariffs good, free trade bad. Whenever we have some sort of protective tariffs, our economic situation improves. Whenever we embrace free trade wholeheartedly, bit by bit our economic situation degrades. And that's been the story for the entire history of our country. And I think it continues to be true now. But to go in here and look a little bit, like I said, it looks at the second half of the 19th century, and that was a very prosperous time period. And it was a time period when we had strong tariff protective measures. And I think the two are related. So like I said, I'm going to read a little bit here about the situation in our country after the Civil War and the trade policy that followed it. So let me jump in here to, this is early, chapter 5. There's quite a few chapters in this book, 43 chapters. So the chapters aren't entirely long, but this is chapter 5, and it's talking about right after the Civil War. And here he says, quote, "Everything was taxed and taxed heavily. In fact, some items were taxed as many as a dozen times as they moved through the manufacturing process. To compensate industry for these added costs, however, and to make certain that customs duties continued to produce a fair share of the required revenues, the Congress passed a succession of war tariffs, the most far-reaching protectionist measures in our history. One of these, the Tariff Act of 1864, increased the average duty on imports covered by customs to over 47%. It was this act, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, that remained essentially in force for the next 2 decades, and laid the solid foundation for fueling the great expansion of American industry, agriculture, and commerce that amazed the world. As Dr. Taussig testifies, the statesmen responsible for the war tariffs were protectionists, and did not attempt to conceal their protectionist leanings. Indeed, there was no reason for Lincoln and his fellow protectionists to conceal what clearly were in the best interests of the United States. They knew what our politicians today have forgotten, that no nation can long survive, as a real nation, without protection of the national means of production, its defense production base, the jobs of its people, and a sound currency, based upon output, and not undermined by eternal inflation. During the war years, 1861 to 65, the tariff produced nearly half the total revenues collected by the Treasury. But as already noted, the tariff and the multiple war taxes could not possibly meet all the demands of the lengthy struggle with more than 1 million men under arms in a nation of less than 30 million people. Still, the loans that were belatedly floated were quickly bought up by citizens in all walks of life. The people knew the Union was in a life-or-death struggle for survival, and they rushed to help in any way they could. It is interesting to note that during the Civil War, there was no market in London or Paris for U.S. government bonds, but only for Confederate bonds, which of course wound up being worthless. This meant that through the war years, very little foreign capital came into the country, and the tremendous industrial expansion was financed almost entirely by Americans, proving once again what a free, independent, and determined people can do on their own under a realistic economic system. The South, equally determined and independent, was defeated more by its past adherence to free trade than by the disparity in population or by any lack of military ability. Indeed, historians are still awed by the courage and skill of the Southern soldier and his unwavering devotion to the cause of the Confederacy. Moreover, in Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and others, the South undoubtedly had superior generals, as their far smaller casualty lists testify. However, when the war began, the North had more than 90% of the nation's manufacturing capacity. The northern states obviously had taken full advantage of the national policy of protection. The South, just as obviously, had not. Although the benefits of that policy had been equally available to the southern states, they had settled for an agrarian economy that acquiesced in playing the role of provider of raw materials to the factories of the North and to the mercantilism of England. A similarly unrealistic approach has captured our present-day policymakers in Washington, with long-range results that could one day prove as disastrous for the whole nation as it did for the Confederacy, unless a realistic trade policy is again adopted. End quote. Okay, so this is something that is pretty obvious to anyone who studies this issue regarding the Civil War, that the South did not have manufacturing capacity. They let the North do the manufacturing, they let Europe do the manufacturing, and they wanted to have a simple agrarian lifestyle and an agrarian nation. And when push came to shove and the conflict came around, they didn't have the weapons. They didn't have the capacity to create the stuff that they needed for engaging in war. And so that's largely considered one of the main reasons why the South lost the war. They didn't have the manufacturing capacity that the North had. And the warning, of course, is that we don't want to follow the same route and basically provide raw materials, food, useless services, and not have a manufacturing base. It's a death sentence to a nation to not have a manufacturing base when it gets into military conflict. And we don't want to take that route. But as you can see, these war tariffs, he says the most far-reaching protectionist measures in history, these 1864 war tariffs, which were pretty high and were signed into law by Abraham Lincoln. And so you can see that this the concept of having tariffs goes way back with the Republican Party. The Democratic Party, not so much, but for many years, the Republican Party was the tariff party, the protectionist party. And unfortunately, we've lost some of that along the way. So let me jump in here and continue the story. He says, quote, "By 1880, the United States of America had overtaken and surpassed England as the industrial leader of the world. Indeed, England, which had stubbornly persisted in its free trade policy, instituted in the 1830s, was now in third place. Germany, initiating our protectionism, was second behind America. The rise of America dazzled the world. Cities seemed to spring up out of the prairies. Railroads crisscrossed the country, binding all sections of the nation together with bonds of steel. Already by 1870, America had built nearly 53,000 miles of railroad, far more than then existed in all of Europe and enough to twice encircle the entire globe with many miles to spare. Another gauge of our country's astonishing progress in this period is the exponential increase in freight traffic. It is estimated that between 1860 and 1900, total domestic freight multiplied 15 times from 50 million to 750 million tons annually. In the early part of the era, the railroads and inland waterways more or less evenly divided most of the haulage between them. But by 1900, pipelines had been built and were already transporting huge quantities of petroleum. All this was accomplished before motor vehicles came into their own. Factories proliferated under protectionism. Between the outbreak of the Civil War and the end of the 19th century, the number of manufacturing plants multiplied from about 140,000 establishments, employing some 1.3 million people who were paid $378 million annually, to 512,000 with 5.3 million employees earning $2.3 billion a year. The value of manufactured products had risen in the same period from under $1.9 billion to more than $13 billion. But as Bogart observes, the remarkable diversity of industries and the increase in the volume of products is not revealed by the statistics of value. Nonetheless, the increase in productive capacity of the individual worker, implicit in the statistics, reflects the ability of protectionism to hold down prices, thereby increasing the standard of living. For it was the domestic competition, as Alexander Hamilton had long ago foreseen, that brings prices down, not imports from abroad, as we have been led to believe in our uncertain era. Protectionism had unleashed the inventive genius of the American people, and the new products and innovations poured forth in a seemingly never-ending stream to create the great cornucopia of the industrial age. Though it has been downgraded in our era, much was made of the inventiveness of our people in those earlier, more confident times. No doubt this accounted for a good deal of our progress, but as Bogart reminds us, it was most of all the enormous domestic market that made possible the profitable introduction of our citizens' inventions. Without that market, which so many of our industries have now been deprived of through free trade, it was inevitable that the innovative spirit of our people would fade and flag. The number of patents has declined dramatically in proportion to the total population and will continue to decline until protectionist policies are restored. End quote. So he hits on a couple of topics there. Essentially, that we had our protectionist policies had surpassed England. Germany had also surpassed England. England was sticking to their free trade, but it was not doing them any good at this time. We were growing by leaps and bounds, and they were stagnating. And he gets into some statistics here, but essentially our railroads and our transport and the number of manufacturing plants and everything else, we were multiplying by leaps and bounds. And it was protectionism that allowed us to do that. So moving right along, as we arrive at the 20th century, there begins to be louder and louder voices arguing against protectionism. And the protectionist policies of the 19th century begin to have to really fight for their existence. So this here in Chapter 7, he says, quote, President McKinley had been reluctant to intervene in Cuba, but after the sinking of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor, he could no longer resist the popular outcry for action, stirred up by the yellow journalism of the time. Teddy Roosevelt was charging up San Juan Hill and on to the Republican nomination for vice president in 1900. Although the war lasted only 4 months, it proved expensive. Congress had acted quickly to raise funds for the military operations, having apparently learned a lesson from Salmon Chase's dilatory attitude of 1861. In 1898, a big loan was authorized. Excise taxes were widely imposed, and for the first time, a tax was levied on inheritances. The maximum inheritance tax was 15%. The tariff, so recently revised in 1897, was permitted to stand. It had produced 50% of the government's total revenues in that same year, and both the Congress and the President probably felt customs duties were doing their fair share. The war did cut the ratio of tariffs to total revenues to 37% in 1898, but it bounced back up to 50% the following year and was to remain in the 40 to 50% range until 1914. The ability of the tariff to carry such a substantial portion of the government's financial burdens in the period after the Spanish-American War was no small accomplishment. The war had given the United States heavy added responsibilities, including the administration of Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Our greater involvement in world affairs required a larger navy and army. In 1904, we took over the Panama Canal project from a French company. In the next dozen years, it was to cost the Treasury more than $400 million, a staggering sum. Without the tariff revenues, none of this would have been possible. Customs duties enabled the government to dismantle the war taxes by 1902 and to pay off a considerable part of the war debt. Indeed, the Treasury's surplus in that year was the highest since 1888, and credit for this must also go to the tariff. The protectionist policy continued to create a healthy climate for expansion, and as the United States grew more prosperous, we could afford to import more goods from abroad, generally buying raw materials and other things we needed, or handmade and luxury goods not produced in our country. In short, protectionism was proving a boon to trade as well as to domestic industry, American workers, and the U.S. Treasury. Nevertheless, as Bogart states, a conviction was steadily gaining ground among tariff reformers that the tariff was largely responsible for the growth of large combinations, the big business trusts, feared and despised by more and more people. The trusts were also being tied, at least in the public view, to the sound money policies of the Republican Party, which was increasingly seen as too pro-business. But, for the moment, the Republican administration held fast to its principles. In 1900, the Congress, with President McKinley's approval, passed a Currency Act, officially placing the United States on the gold standard and committing the Treasury to maintain parity between gold and the dollar. The government's sound money policy and protectionism were now legally linked, giving the full and majestic sanction of the law to the explicit policy that had prevailed since the very beginning of the Republic. The presidential campaign of 1900, between McKinley and the silver-voiced standard-bearer of the Democrat cause, William Jennings Bryan, was again fought out on these twin issues, with an added arrow aimed by Bryan at the imperialism he saw in the recent war with Spain. McKinley defeated Bryan by an even larger margin in both the popular and electoral vote than in 1896, and the country appeared irrevocably committed to protection and sound currency. But, less than a year later, while greeting citizens at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, the president was fatally shot by Leon Czartoryski, the son of Russian immigrants and the disciple of the anarchist Emma Goldman. William McKinley was the third Republican president to be assassinated within 36 years. Abraham Lincoln was the first in 1865, James A. Garfield in 1881, and now McKinley in 1901. End quote. That really is something when you think about it. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, and then James Garfield, only 15 years later, another U.S. president is assassinated, back to back like that. And then only 20 years after that, another one, McKinley, is assassinated. 3 protectionist presidents all assassinated. So as you can see, there's a couple of tariff bills. There was the 1897 tariff revision. He says basically the tariffs were able to pay off all of our war debt from the Spanish-American War. But there was opposition growing that tariffs were responsible for the big business trusts and combinations and monopolies. It's all pro-business. The tariffs are pro-business. The Republicans are the party of big business. Now remember, at the time, this is long before the so-called Southern Strategy or the great switcheroo that occurred apparently under Nixon I guess, begun under Goldwater and occurred during Nixon's attempt to get elected or reelected. The Southern strategy of bringing all the Southern states into the Republican fold and letting the Northern states go, and so that the states that used to be Republican are now Democrat, and the states that used to be Democrat are now Republican. But that's clearly like too simplistic a way to put it, because even back over 100 years ago, long before this grand switch, the Republicans were still castigated as being like the big business party, and the Democrats were like the populists. William Jennings Bryan, the power of the people. That sort of framing has been going on for a very long time. So let me just keep reading here a little bit. We're starting to approach the point at which protectionism is really attacked. It's starting to grow in disfavor a little bit, but not yet. McKinley is a big-time protectionist. He's assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt is a protectionist, but he's not as adamant about it. But bit by bit, support for protectionism begins to erode around this time frame, around the turn of the century. So jumping in here, continuing, he says, quote, "The progressives, basing their arguments on the deepening public suspicion of trusts and monopolies, prepared to wage war on 4 fronts. The first had as its objective the demise of the tariff. However, the substantial revenues that would be lost by killing off the tariff had to be replaced, and that was to be the function of the graduated income tax, the second front of the attack. The other 2 fronts, opened almost simultaneously, were, third, the restoration of the central bank, which Andrew Jackson had finished off 8 decades earlier in the face of Nicholas Biddle's bold attempt to buy Congress, and fourth, an amendment to the Constitution to elect U.S. senators by popular vote instead of by the state legislatures, as the Founding Fathers had stipulated. Combined, these 4 measures were to foist off a second American Revolution on a largely unsuspecting and complacent populace. This coup was accomplished within a very few years without the firing of a single shot. Indeed, it was fought out entirely on what appeared to be the open stage of public opinion and the legislative process. Yet in the wings, the manipulators were pulling the strings that kept the politicians dancing to their tune, while their propagandists softened up the voters with an unrelenting propaganda barrage on all 4 fronts. The opening battle was the debate over a new tariff act in 1909. It had been a dozen years since Congress had tackled the trade question, and during that time the media muckrakers had so thoroughly identified protectionism with the monopolists that even the Republican Party felt compelled to call for a change. The focus of the battle in Congress became not so much the tariff per se as the income tax which was to replace it. The progressive Republicans, led by Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, teamed up with the Democrats under Representative Cordell Hull of Tennessee in pushing for the graduated tax. Arrayed against them was a powerful triumvirate in the Senate: Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, Elihu Root of New York, and Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. President William Howard Taft stood aside from the dispute until June of 1909, when he sent Congress a suggestion that since the Supreme Court had declared the income tax unconstitutional some years earlier, the Congress ought to propose an amendment to the Constitution to clear the way. But Taft, in a sophistic contradiction, himself proposed an income tax on corporations that was to serve as a revenue source while the constitutional amendment was wending its way through the state legislatures. The corporate levy was euphemistically termed an excise tax to get around the Constitution. The Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, which encompassed the excise tax on corporations and produced as a side effect the constitutional amendment to authorize the graduated income tax, finally emerged after a long and bitter battle on Capitol Hill. Much to the surprise and chagrin of the muckrakers, it was enacted as an essentially protectionist law. American industry and workers were granted a temporary reprieve from the anti-protectionist onslaught, but Payne-Aldrich introduced a dangerous heresy into the administration of the tariff, which in the end was to utterly destroy the protectionist principle upon which the nation was built. The seed of the free trade takeover was cleverly planted in a provision granting the president the authority to control the rates of duties on imports. Until this act, Congress had jealously guarded its responsibility, as clearly spelled out in the Constitution, to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Moreover, this clause in Article 1, Section 8, dealing with the powers of Congress, had been reinforced in Section 10, prohibiting the states from levying duties on imports or exports without consent of the Congress, reserving all such duties for the federal treasury, and plainly setting forth that all laws dealing with imports and exports shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. Now, in 1909, it handed the president the option to increase tariffs up to 25% of the value of the goods imported from countries which discriminated against the United States in international trade. The dangerous precedent was established. The executive branch had been given control over the Congress's constitutional prerogative to regulate trade. The first crack had been opened in the protectionist wall that for 120 years had guarded the interests of the workers in industry, agriculture, and commerce of the United States. Quite obviously, without a constitutional amendment, the Congress did not have the authority to deliver these important functions of government over to the executive branch, nor did the president have the legal right to accept such authority from the Congress. Yet, like so many other things in the long, slow surrender of the Constitution by the legislative branch and the repeated usurpations of authority by the executive and the judiciary, the transfer of power over the nation's foreign trade was acquiesced by a public made malleable by misinformation. The Payne-Aldrich tariff, masquerading as a protectionist law, proved to be a major wrecking ball in the long, slow but sure smashing of our Constitution's intrinsic structure, by implicitly paving the way for the income tax, which had been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the previous decade. Payne-Aldrich blazed the way down the primrose path not only for eventual extinction of the tariff and the system of protection, but for unsound money and the gradual loss of many liberties Americans of older generations took for granted. For the income tax and the greatly expanded Internal Revenue Service it spawned enabled the government to force open the doors into our homes and offices and privacy on a scale Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, and the other founders could never have conceived. The guarantees they had so carefully embedded in the Constitution were now about to be filched from the American people in the name of progress. End quote. So you can see this book sort of does seem to have a kind of conservative slant to it. One thing that's important is that the control over tariffs and the control over duties belongs to Congress. But Congress passed a bill essentially handing the president control over tariffs. And of course, this has happened again and again and again as Congress continues to hand over to the executive branch and its various departments and agencies, really the sprawling bureaucracy of the administrative state, which falls under the executive branch. The Congress has continually handed them more and more decision-making capacity, the capacity to create punishments and fines, and the capacity to essentially create laws, regulations of various types that they spring up in the executive branch. And Congress really, the right to create law belongs to Congress, but like so many other things, Congress just keeps giving their rights to the executive branch. Now, how that spelled the beginning of the end for protectionism, I'm not entirely sure. I don't think it's a good thing for the executive branch to have control over these things, but so long as Congress is more protectionist than the White House, if you get a free trader in the White House and they slash the tariffs, so be it. But the Congress could always, if they wanted to, take back the authority that they have handed over if they didn't want the White House to slash tariffs. So I don't always understand entirely how that really was the beginning of the end, to hand the president that control. The real problem is bringing the income tax into play. So the income tax had been ruled unconstitutional, and that's why we have a constitutional amendment allowing the income tax, which never should have passed. But it's important to bring back to this point again and again that when you think about the tariffs or the taxes, the income taxes, you have to understand that when this stuff was set in place, there was a replacement. The income tax was replacing the removal of the tariffs. The income tax exists because we stopped doing the tariffs. And now many people will argue against the imposition of tariffs on free market grounds, but you obviously can make every bit as strong of an argument, if not stronger, really, against income tax on those same grounds. But we've just grown very accustomed to the income tax. But when we talk about the tariff, we always have to remember that we're talking about the tariff or the income tax. We shouldn't be talking about simply piling additional tariffs on top of the existing income tax. That wouldn't really be the best approach. So then that was apparently the setup for what comes next, which is the real attack on tariffs and the overthrow of the protective system. So in Chapter 8 here, discussing this, he says, quote, "The American protective system was initially overthrown through the efforts of two men who openly proclaimed that their ultimate goal was the creation of a new world order, not only in international trade and finance, but in the socio-political realm as well. This pair, so similar in their thinking that they came to be regarded as almost one, were Woodrow Wilson and his alter ego, Edward Mandell House. Sir Horace Plunkett called the Wilson-House relationship the strangest and most fruitful personal alliance in human history. Nothing sinister was suggested by this remark. Indeed, Sir Horace was a friend of both men, but contrary to his appraisal, the fruits of their collaboration were ultimately to prove tragic, not only for America, but for Europe and, in fact, for all mankind. Woodrow Wilson was a professor and historian who became president of Princeton, and after less than 2 years as governor of New Jersey, was catapulted into the White House. Edward House, the man who more than any other put him there, was a quiet, unassuming Texan with a sharp mind that seemed to cut through human subterfuge to the very heart of large, momentous matters. Both Wilson and House were quintessential products of progressivism. Wilson was an anti-Jeffersonian Democrat, and although he claimed he was not a socialist, he supported many of the reforms the socialists struggled to bring about. Albert C. Ganley, in his fine little book, The Progressive Movement, says that Wilson moved far beyond Theodore Roosevelt and other progressives in recommending a limited amount of socialism. House, however, was seen by a close contemporary as a pronounced radical, more advanced in his ideas than the persons he was working with. Indeed, House, by his own admission, was an admirer of Karl Marx and of the European revolutionaries of 1848. This was reflected in his 1912 novel, Philip Drew, Administrator, in which the hero, obviously modeled on House himself, became the reformist dictator of the United States. Woodrow Wilson, as president of Princeton from 1902 to 1910, was also regarded by some as a radical, although on a somewhat different plane, for trying to break up the old student eating clubs and other actions aimed against the traditions of the college. Elected governor of New Jersey in 1910, he pushed through a broad program of progressive legislation and won national attention for his attacks on what were then regarded as the twin devils of the left, the trusts and the tariff. Edward House did not meet Wilson until November 1911, when the governor came to visit him at the Hotel Gotham on New York's Fifth Avenue. This fateful rendezvous resulted in what came to be seen by both as a mystical merger of their minds and personalities. "A few weeks after we met," House said later, "and after we had exchanged confidences which men usually do not exchange except after years of friendship, I asked him if he realized that we had only known one another for so short a time. He replied, 'My dear friend, we have known one another always, and I think this is true.'" Professor Charles Seymour, later president of Yale, noted in the amazingly revealing 4-volume Intimate Papers of Colonel House, which he edited, that House and Wilson communicated with each other in a special code known only to themselves. End quote. So there's not an awful lot of really valuable content there. He's just introducing Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson has a sidekick by the name of House, Edward House, and they actually had a kind of strange relationship. House kind of followed Wilson everywhere. They were never separated. It almost seemed like House was the one pulling the strings. But, Wilson was no dummy. I'm not sure he was just a puppet getting his strings pulled. He was the president of Princeton and then the governor of New Jersey. But both of them were deeply opposed to tariffs, and they were both very progressive. They were both reformers. And they had big ideas for things that they wanted to twist around and change and alter. And boy, did they. So let me continue on from there, where he says, quote, "Soon after taking office, President Wilson summoned a special session of Congress to apply the torch to the tariff. The Democrats had gained complete control of both the House and Senate, and they were ready to do the president's bidding. Representative Oscar Underwood of Alabama, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and a Wilson rival for the 1912 presidential nomination, already had a trade bill in hand, one that had been vetoed by William Howard Taft in the previous session. The Underwood Tariff Act of 1913 sailed through the House in record time. The Senate, which used to be a more deliberative body, took a good deal longer to consider the measure. But with prodding from the president, who denounced the industrial lobbyists as insidious villains for trying to preserve some protection for their companies, the Senate finally approved the bill in September. On October 3, 1913, it became law. This revolutionary act set the nation on the road to the free trade system which now prevails. There were detours along the way, particularly between the two world wars, but since 1913, the United States has been committed to free trade." End quote. Okay, so you see here the Underwood Tariff Act of 1913, and this was an act that had been put forward previously, but the Republican president before Wilson, who was William Taft, had vetoed that. But when Wilson came into office, the bill came up again, and Wilson passed it, signed it, and passed it. And according to this book, that was really the turning point when we became a predominantly free trade nation. So it certainly wasn't the Republicans or the big business Republicans who had advocated this free trade internationalism, but it was the progressive Democrats. It was Wilson, and it was House, and it was the quasi-socialist progressive Democrats who instituted international free trade, and it was the Republicans who have been trying to hang on to protectionism. But, as we have seen for the past 100 years, this was just over 100 years ago, as we've seen for the past 110 years, the Republicans lost and the Democrats won, as happens over and over again. The Wilson administration was a really, really big one and significant one for changes in the way our country works. And that, of course, that big one right there with the dissolution of our tariff protective system and the creation of international free trade. So moving on from there, he says, quote, "After the tariff barriers were breached, the progressive revolution galloped ahead on all its other fronts. The two critical constitutional amendments went into effect. one, stripping state legislatures of their traditional power to elect U.S. senators, the other authorizing the income tax. The latter had been approved by two-thirds of the states barely in time, Dr. Dewey wrote, to enable the Democrats to utilize this revenue to make good the losses expected under the 1913 Tariff Act. As with so many other taxes levied in this century, the income tax began modestly. Only 1% on incomes in excess of $3,000 or $4,000 for married couples, with small surtaxes ranging up to 6% on incomes from $20,000 to over $500,000. But the sluice gates had been opened, and from that point on, the government was able to siphon off an ever-increasing portion of the earnings of individual citizens, as well as the profits of corporations tapped since the 1909 Tariff Act bypassed the Constitution. The year 1914 marked the end of customs duties playing the dominant role in producing revenues to run the government, a role they had heroically played for 125 years. Beginning in 1915, the tariff started a long slide downhill in its relative importance as generator of revenue. The income tax, slowly at first but with steadily mounting acquisitiveness, picked up the part, adding to it over the years until it reached an almost confiscatory role in some income brackets and took an unhealthy bite out of the wages and other earnings of the vast majority of our citizens. Although it is acknowledged that taxes add to inflation, to my knowledge, nothing has been done to compare the relative roles of income tax versus protectionism in generating the long and often accelerating rise in prices since 1913. Such comparison would undoubtedly prove embarrassing to the free traders, for it would certainly show that the income tax has added exponentially to prices, whereas the protective tariff helped hold back inflation between George Washington's first administration in 1789 and Woodrow Wilson's Progressive Revolution of 1913. The tariff not only paid most of the costs of government up until 1915, it also took that heavy fiscal load off the backs of our people and shifted it to foreign governments and exporters attempting to exploit the great American market. Contrary to the belief of free trade advocates, tariffs on imports are not necessarily paid by American consumers. They are frequently paid by foreign governments, subsidizing exports to the United States, as the files on numerous countervailing duty and dumping cases testify in the murky archives of our Treasury and Commerce departments. End quote. So in this section here, he's talking about the tariff and the income tax and how the constitutions for the income tax were approved just in time to collect the money which needed to be collected, since they had already cut the tariff rates down dramatically in the 1913 Tariff Act. And they had to get these constitutional amendments passed so they could start siphoning the Americans' money out of their paychecks. He says, like most taxes, it started low, 1%, and it's nowhere near 1% today. It's gone up bit by bit by bit ever since then. And, of course, that generates the vast majority of the income for the federal government, money that used to come from tariffs. And the other thing that I think that I like is when he says at the very end, he says, contrary to the belief of free trade advocates, tariffs on imports are not necessarily paid by American consumers. They're frequently paid by foreign governments, subsidizing exports to the United States. So the foreign government will literally pay the tariff rate. They will effectively subsidize their industries so their industries can sell to us for lower prices so that they can still continue to get over the tariff wall. You know, our tariff raises the price of the foreign good, makes it less competitive. The foreign government wants it to be more competitive, so they subsidize the industry to push the price back down again from where it was, to where it was before the tariff pushed it up. So in a sense, the foreign government is subsidizing the foreign products. We pay the same amount for the tariff before the tariff and after the tariff, except the government gets revenues and the foreign government has expenditures. It seems ridiculous that we have decided that what we really need to do is tax productivity. Like, you should be taxing things you want to discourage. That's why we have high taxes on cigarettes and alcohol. And marijuana has a high tax. Things that they call them vice taxes. If we don't really want to encourage you to do it, we can tax it, make it more expensive, and make it slightly less appealing, and slightly fewer people will participate in it because they don't want to have to pay the extra amount. That's how supply and demand works. So when you tax something, you raise the price, you lower the demand. So when we tax productivity and work, we lower the demand for workers. We lower people's inclination to work because they know that a portion of their paycheck is going to be taken from them. So taxation always discourages whatever it's appended to. So when you append the taxation to productivity and work, it discourages work. When you append that taxation to the importation of foreign products, it discourages importing foreign products, which by default encourages domestic manufacturing. To me, this seems a no-brainer. But it is important to point out that, yes, taxes are not always entirely paid for by consumers. Free traders will always tell you, well, you're going to pay those taxes one way or another. They're just going to jack the prices up. That's not a full analysis. That's not the whole story. So anyway, let's jump on forward from there. The last section I want to read is this one, where he says, quote, "The citizenry believes the Federal Reserve Bank is a government agency, subject to control by the three great branches of the government, legislative, executive, and judiciary. Actually, the Fed is owned by private shareholders, most of them representing the great commercial banks of Wall Street, which in turn owe extensive obligations to banks in Tokyo, London, Paris, Frankfurt, and other world finance centers. The president does appoint the members of the Federal Reserve Board, but these must always be at least acceptable to the big commercial bankers, or preferably products of the financial establishment like Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman who matriculated at Chase Manhattan. Moreover, the Federal Reserve Board does not actually govern the Federal Reserve System. It serves more in the nature of an advisory body, or a liaison group, between the International Banking Confederation and the federal government. Policy is ostensibly set by the Open Market Committee, which the Wall Street Journal calls the Fed's key policy-making body. It was the Open Market Committee that triggered the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed, by summarily tightening credit in 1929 to a point where it garroted the national economy. This was the action that sent the world into its 1930s tailspin, not the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, as the latter-day mythmakers would have us believe. It is not the purpose of this book to examine the labyrinthian ways of the Federal Reserve System. This has been done in authentic detail by others in recent times, including Thibaut de Saint-Phal, a former director of the Export-Import Bank, author-scholar Eustace Mullins, Donald F. Kettle of the University of Virginia, and William Greeter in his monumental 1987 book, Secrets of the Temple: How the Federal Reserve Runs the Country. However, the Federal Reserve has played the key role in this era of one-sided free trade that is stripping the United States of its mighty capital-industrial base. Indeed, the Fed's policies have made this era possible, and through its support of the World Bank and other multinational lenders, it has indirectly, but no less certainly, stimulated the building of rival foreign industries in Europe, Japan, the Pacific Rim, Brazil, and even in communist China, the Soviet Union, and the rest of the Soviet bloc. U.S. commercial banks have also played a major role in this suicidal drive to create and expand foreign competition for American industries and for the jobs of our workers. But the Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Bank of America, and others would never have been able to embark on their wild lending sprees of the recent past if they had not gotten the green light from the Federal Reserve. The secret coup which the money changers in the Wall Street temples slipped over on the American people in 1913, with the support of Wilson and House and a compliant Congress, created the machinery which has governed the country's economy ever since. by destroying the protective tariff, replacing it with the income tax, and creating a privately owned central bank empowered to issue currency based upon debt. They turned over control of our government to a small band of bankers who preside over the Federal Reserve System. Generations of Americans, as yet unborn, will still be digging themselves out from under the mountainous debt dumped on the United States of America by the Federal Reserve and its multifarious subsidiaries and affiliates. End quote. So just kind of a slight overview there of the Federal Reserve. He doesn't talk much about it. He says this isn't a book about the Federal Reserve, so he doesn't talk much about it. But he says that the Federal Reserve is ultimately responsible for the crash of 1929 and not the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which is commonly blamed. And he says that the banks have done a lot to destroy our manufacturing sector and to send all of our jobs overseas and to loan boatloads of money to nations so that they can compete with us economically. Banks have done a great amount of harm, but none of it would be possible without the Federal Reserve. It's astonishing to me when I think about it that the Wilson administration was able to do so much. In the midst of World War I, well, World War I we hadn't entered World War I at that time, but the tariff system essentially dismantled, the income tax put into place, the Federal Reserve System put into place, and our involvement in World War I really involving us in international affairs to a degree we hadn't previously been. So the Wilson administration was pretty significant, and it's too bad that he says it was Wilson and House and a compliant Congress. A compliant Congress is par for the course. So that's all I wanted to talk about there. He does get into Wilson. I'm going to talk some more about Wilson. The Wilson administration was pretty interesting and impactful administration in our history. So in some future books, I'll be looking a little bit more closely at that. The point I wanted to make here was that from the Civil War up through the Wilson administration, we were a very protectionist country. It's not something that's unknown to the United States, not in the least. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll catch you on the flip side.